In the early 19th century, European philosophy was defined by the pursuit of a total, objective map of reality. G.W.F. Hegel attempted to achieve complete knowledge by adopting what he called the perspective of eternity, a disengaged view where every human action is merely a data point in a logical system. This is 19th century Copenhagen. Among these specific crowds and these historical buildings, Søren Kierkegaard offered a counter-proposal. The detached, systematic view of the universe fails to account for the actual experience of the person living within it. Kierkegaard's critique was directed at the panoptic view of these metaphysical systems. By focusing on the universal and the eternal, a philosopher like Hegel makes the individual human subject accidental, a vanishing point in a larger machine. To the existing individual, abstract mathematical certainties offer very little. The urgent concerns of a human life require a truth that is valid for the person making the choice, rather than a disengaged theory that applies to everyone and no one simultaneously. He called this subjective truth. This truth is the highest attainable for an existing person. It is an ineffable reality that emerges from one's situated commitments and effects. It is felt and lived, rather than reasoned or explained through a syllogism. To Kierkegaard, an objective map of reality is useless if it cannot help an individual navigate their own life. It fails to answer the only question that matters: what am I to do? Kierkegaard defines the human self as a relational achievement, rather than a fixed substance. It is a process that must continually balance opposing forces to avoid falling into despair. Visualize a central node held in tension. The self is a relation relating to itself, struggling to maintain equilibrium. Facticity represents the inescapable facts you did not choose. Transcendence is the capacity to question your situation and make decisions exceeding your circumstances. Existing in this unresolvable tension makes human nature indefinable. We are initially nothing, and we only become something afterward through the meanings and values we assign to our own lives. Confronting the scale of this freedom produces a specific sensation, the dizziness that comes from realizing you alone are responsible for your own projects. Kierkegaard identifies this state as anxiety. It is a structural element of the human condition, the spirit's reaction as it looks down into its own possibility and realizes that no external law or divine will can justify its next move. Anxiety serves as proof of our autonomy. We are condemned to be free, authoring our lives without the safety of external excuses or deterministic laws. In a modern society, this inwardness is threatened by the public or the crowd. Kierkegaard saw the press and mass culture as a leveling force that attempts to turn unique individuals into a homogeneous mass. This collective identity offers a tranquilizing existence. By following public opinion, drifting in lockstep with others, a person avoids the personal responsibility that freedom demands. Kierkegaard describes inauthenticity as the act of fleeing from oneself. It is an attempt to be rid of the self by letting others decide how one's life should be lived. True inwardness requires stripping away public distractions to face your isolation. This statue captures that solitary gaze, someone who has stopped relying on the crowd. Moving toward authenticity requires a personality-defining commitment. It is a sober, earnest decision to bind the disjointed moments of your life into a coherent whole, independent of what society expects. However, these self-interpretations remain unstable. Because you are free, you can always question your own identity and assign new meanings to who you are in the future. This makes genuine individuality a difficult prospect. It cuts the individual off from the comforting, shared truths of the public, leaving them entirely answerable for their own choices. This problem of individuality becomes a philosophical crisis when it meets the ethical sphere. In the 19th century, ethics was largely understood through the concept of Sittlichkeit, the customary, universal morality of a rational society. Individuals subordinate private desires to the universal community. Moral acts are publicly justified by social norms. Prioritizing private intentions is a failure of reason. The tragic hero, Agamemnon sacrificing his daughter to save the fleet, is ethically justified because it serves a universally understood good. Because Agamemnon can explain his reasons in shared language, he remains within the universal. He can be understood, judged, and ultimately honored by his community. But Kierkegaard identifies a specific point where this shared, public framework of justification entirely breaks down and fails. He argues that there are subjective truths higher than universal morality, situations where the individual must suspend their social obligations to be true to themselves. If the highest purpose of a human life is simply to vanish into universal social roles, then the uniqueness of the individual is effectively lost. To demonstrate this limit, Kierkegaard analyzes the biblical story of the Akedah, God's command to Abraham to sacrifice his son Isaac. Look at Rembrandt's depiction. This is a concrete, violent demand. Abraham must kill the son he loves, an act violating every universal moral law. Under the framework of universal ethics, there is no category for this act other than murder. Abraham cannot appeal to the universal to justify himself. Unlike the tragic hero, he is not saving a nation or serving a social good. He has no public explanation that his community could ever understand. Kierkegaard calls this the teleological suspension of the ethical. Abraham suspends his moral duty as a father for the sake of a higher, absolute purpose, a direct relationship with God that transcends social laws. This places Abraham in absolute linguistic isolation. Because his commitment is higher than the universal, he cannot make himself understood to anyone else. He is entirely alone with a truth that no one else can validate. This narrative reveals a paradox. If Abraham is right to obey, then the single, isolated individual stands higher than the universal community. The individual becomes the final authority over a duty that the rest of the world sees as insane. This transition to the religious sphere represents a limit for human thought. It is a gap that cannot be crossed using historical evidence, systematic logic, or the consensus of society. Institutional religion, what Kierkegaard called Christendom, tries to hide this gap. It uses imposing architecture and social structures to make faith appear rational and comfortable. Kierkegaard rejects this comfort. He defines true faith as an encounter with the absurd, the realization that your highest commitment fundamentally contradicts and offends your own reason. He points to the absolute paradox, the claim that the infinite, eternal God became a finite, temporal human. This is a logical contradiction that cannot be proven or understood. It can only be believed by virtue of the absurd. Acknowledging the absurd is a rigorous phenomenological observation. It is the recognition that human reason is finite and must eventually fail when it is confronted with the infinite. To Kierkegaard, any attempt to rationally justify or systematically map human existence is a retreat from the reality of our condition. Because objective certainty is impossible for the human subject, the individual is forced to make a decision in the absence of evidence. He calls this the leap. It is a passionate commitment made without the safety net of societal approval or rational proof. This leap is a dynamic way of living. It is the ongoing effort to maintain your subjective truth while existing between the finite and the infinite. Holding to a subjective truth in this way is precarious and isolating. Choosing to live this truth often leads to loneliness and despair. There is no one else to validate your leap, and no external system to tell you that you are right. Authentic existence requires refusing the tranquilizing comfort of the crowd. It means accepting the permanent dizziness of your own freedom and stepping alone into your own subjective truth.